In the face of the daunting challenge that is climate change, it is important to remember that we possess the power to create a better future. While the impacts of climate change are undeniable and at times overwhelming, there are countless reasons to remain hopeful. First and foremost, we are witnessing an unprecedented global awakening to the urgent need for climate action. Communities, governments, and businesses around the world are coming together like never before to address this crisis. The voices of young activists, scientists, and concerned citizens are resonating louder than ever, pushing the change at every level of society. Innovation is another great source of optimism. Every day, new breakthroughs in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and eco-friendly technologies are emerging. We are on the brink of a transformative advancement that will enable us to reduce our carbon footprint and transition towards a more sustainable, resilient world. The power of collective action cannot be underestimated. We've seen nations commit to ambitious climate goals and grassroots movements making an impact on local levels. The Paris Agreement and other international agreements demonstrate a shared commitment to a greener future. Nature itself is a remarkable ally to our fight against climate change. Ecosystem restoration, reforestation, and sustainable land management can help us absorb carbon emissions and protect biodiversity. By working with nature rather than against it, we can mitigate the worst effects of climate change. Each and every one of us has a role to play, from reducing our personal carbon footprint to supporting policies and initiatives that promote sustainability. We can contribute to a positive change. Our voices matter, our choices matter, and they can inspire others to take action as well. Remember, hope is a powerful force. It's a belief that we can overcome even the most significant challenges. Together with determination and a shared vision, we can create a world where future generations can thrive, surrounded by clean air, abundant resources, and a stable climate. Let's embrace this challenge as an opportunity to build a brighter, more sustainable future for all. The path may be difficult, but the destination is worth every effort. Welcome back to the live stream. This week we've got John Hearn facing off against Professor Steve Keen. It's a battle between neoclassicals and post Keynesians. It's going to be fun. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show. Welcome back to the live stream. It is September 16th, 2023. We've got Professor Steve Keen facing off against Professor John Hearn today. It's Daniel's birthday, apparently. Happy birthday, Daniel. I'm going to bring him on first in a second. We are having, I should clarify, John is having technical issues with the internet. Hopefully we can sort that out. But it is what it is. And apparently it is Mike Radzicki's wife's birthday as well. We're putting it out there, identifying birth dates. We're going to be giving out addresses soon. Let's bring on Mike first. We never bring on Mike first. Mike, here he is.
Hello, everybody.
Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Doing well. Just got back from my grandson's soccer game, and a little later on today, I'll be doing some drywalling at the house. And one of our projects is going well at WPI System Dynamics Modeling on rethinking and redesigning clinical trials in the pharmaceutical business. So all is well.
Cool stuff. Excellent. So I'm trying to organize a debate here between a neoclassical and a post Keynesian, and it is not working out right now. I had really high hopes for this show. It was going to be a test because we've got an Austrian economist coming in a few weeks as well. So I wanted to kind of suss things out and see if we could try a slightly different format. And that's not working. Now, I do know Steve is more than capable of trashing neoclassicals on his own without a debatee. But it would have been nice to have John here. So hopefully Dan's kind of working in the background to try to get him on. Let's bring on Steve next. Steve, here he is.
Hey,
how you doing,
slightly
Steve?
better. Not too bad. I'm actually, this is my office in Budapest, at the Center for Long-Term Sustainability here, and it's rather marvelous. So better than my usual background. I've even got a collar on in honor here. It won't go as far as a tie, but I could even put a jacket on.
Hey, can we
rather more civilized?
Let's just, I'm going to cut you off for a second just because I want to make sure John's aware that he is on. I'm going to bring him on. John, can you hear
us? Looks like
John,
internet.
John, you are live. The world is watching you right now. Can you hear us? I can see he's got a poor internet connection. That is going to be an issue. John, can you hear us?
Not going to work.
Daniel, maybe work with him a little bit more. I'm going to take him off screen. If you're in communicate, I'll just bring Dan on. Dan, are you in communication with him? I can't hear you, Dan. You've got to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
No, but I'll keep trying with him. So, yeah, I'll work in the background.
All right. I'm just going to... Oh, it's turning off the wrong person here. Oh, I love it. I love it. We finally got Steve. He's got one of the best internet connections I've seen in a year on this show.
I know. Yeah.
We had a potentially groundbreaking debate about to happen. We'll see what happens there. Well, let's try again. John, can you hear us?
Looks like John. I think you better get John to try it again from his office rather than home, and get an wired Ethernet connection. Because it looks like he's not hearing anything, and this is not a good way to have a debate, unfortunately.
You definitely have the advantage. I can see
and I don't need it.
His internet connection is 0 out of 10 right now. So
I'll have to try it again when you can go for the office. That's the only way to go.
Is there anything I can do to improve the sound at this end?
You need to have a proper internet connection, John. You need to plug your computer into the internet connection itself. Your Wi-Fi isn't acceptable for the stream.
Yeah, but it's rather bad quality sound. Do you have an Ethernet cable, John? Yeah, don't think we can try turning off video because it would just be a bit, stale that way.
I know, John. John, I know Dan is trying to communicate with you via email.
Is it possible for him to do audio via the phone? And
I have restarted the computer. I can restart it again. I've got some headphones around.
No, John, if you can hear me, what we need, the problem is you need to plug your computer directly into the internet. Your wireless connection is not working.
Mm.
I haven't got it. Oh, goodness.
Dan,
Yeah.
have you articulated that to John?
He hasn't
That
responded
is-
to my email yet.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right, your sound is coming clearer now. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm.
John, you need to plug your internet. You need to be like physically connected to the internet. Your Wi-Fi is not going to work.
I can hear no one at the moment.
Have you checked your email? Use the chat. Steve, tell us what's wrong with neoclassical economics. Fundamentals. Fundamental
Oh, well,
principles.
I mean, it'd be rather unfortunate to do that without John being able to respond. But I'm willing to. I think maybe the best thing to do is get John to organise to get an Ethernet cable before the next time he does it. Preferably do it from the office rather than from home, and get a decent connection. Otherwise, there won't be a chance to do it properly. But what I can do, and he says he's not going to be here, so it's going to be just us rather than me versus John. But what I can do is actually cover one of the things I was going to do with John anyway, which is talk about the actual cost structures of firms and how the neoclassical model is a fantasy. And as it happens, I've just done some new work on this front, which I'd be happy to present. And I've actually got a decent video connection to internet connection to be able to do it too, and show how what they think is the case with firms, rising marginal cost and falling marginal revenue. It ain't the real world, and when you look at the real world, it's impossible for neoclassical theory to work either micro or macro, and that's one of the things that I find. John's back again. That's what I would have liked to discuss, but it's with the level of connection, it looks like it's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
What do you reckon, Daniel? Is it feasible? He's just not going to manage it by the looks of things. Keeps on jumping in and out.
Here's the thing: is nobody is. He just needs to have a wired internet connection. If he could look at the chat, or just catch what we're saying. You need, John. You can't work this on Wi-Fi. You're going to have to plug it in directly. Now he's got a strong connection now.
Can he phone into the stream?
No. We're definitely don't have that capacity on Restream. Anyways, well, Steve, what do you got to present?
Okay, well, I'm actually writing a new book, and the title of the book is Rebuilding Economics from the Top Down, with the idea being that neoclassical theory has always tried to build macro from micro, and everything in neoclassical theory starts from microeconomics. If you look at their logic, whenever they have a disaster like the Great Depression, they go back to microeconomics and come back out again with the same belief system after the crisis is over. And that's what happened with the global financial crisis as well. So they're back into the usual microeconomic nonsense. Now, if you look at the empirical research into the cost structure, in what firms actually do, you find that everything about their cost structures is the virtual opposite of what the theory tells you is the case. And what I was looking forward to doing as John is actually posing some of these things for him and showing how different it is. So I'll see if I can share my screen. Let me do that.
Share it.
Okay. Let's see. And I'll change the scale because I've currently got it. I've just got myself a new monitor here, which is an absolute giant. It's a, hang on, we go. It's a 43-inch screen, absolutely giant. So what you're looking at, can you see it easily there? Is that readable for people on the?
Yeah, I'm just adjusting some things here.
Okay. Probably better if you can maximize that at the expense of the chat window or the or our faces there. But I'll see if I can actually.
You can also
Change
zoom
the
it in from the browser too, Steve, if you want, right?
Sorry?
I think that you can also zoom it from the browser too. Or what is that program?
That's a Word document.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So it's not the browser. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I've got there is this is out of a textbook of one of my favorite people, William fucking Nordhaus. Okay. This is the textbook he took over from Samuelson. So this is the horse's mouth, or in the case of Neoclassical Economics, this is the horse's ass, because they speak out of their asses. So a horse walking backwards is a decent model of neoclassical theory, and shitting as it goes forwards. And this is a piece of shit that they produce, which is what they think is the cost structure of the typical firm. So what you get is this idea of, I'll start with this diagram, because the one down the bottom is the one that they thrust down students' throats all the time. And this has the classic U-shaped cost curves. So his average costs, which fall for a while and then reach a minimum and then they rise. And what's causing it to rise is diminishing marginal productivity. And this is part of the philosophy. That you've got a factory which has fully employed capital. And if you want to increase your output, then you've got to add more and more what they call variable units, what they pretty much mean as labor, more and more labor to each machine. And what happens is, for a while, when you start doing that, can you see my cursor on the screen, by the way, or not? I'm not sure that you can. I'm not seeing it myself. But this is the pink one down the bottom is the MC, marginal cost curve. And that's supposed to represent the marginal cost to produce, the cost of producing the last item. And it's rising because the idea is that you've got a factory being used at actually past full capacity. So you have an ideal ratio of workers to machinery, and you've got such a level of demand that you've got more workers per machine than is ideal, which means that each additional worker, even though you're paying exactly the same amount to hire them, and they're exactly as productive as individually as each worker you've previously hired, you get less output from each of them because of this going to be working past the level of full capacity. So you have rising marginal cost here. And if you also assume, which they do, that the market is what they call perfectly competitive, which means in their jargon that the individual firm faces a horizontal demand curve. I've got my hooker going, have I now, Mike? I wish it was. I'm in Budapest. I can't possibly afford that. This is my little anti-COVID number. After getting COVID recently, I'm doubly paranoid.
John, can you hear us now? John?
No.
Nah.
Not going to work, guys. John, we'll have to try it. Dan, I think it's probably best if you tell John just isn't going to be effective. So we should do this, in a few weeks' time. Once we have to test it properly with a T45 cable, an Ethernet cable. Yeah. What do you reckon?
Yep, you got it.
Can you give a thumbs up on the screen, John, if you heard that? All right. Well, that's it, John. See you later. So get back into it, Steve.
Okay. So this is now I can see my mouse too, which is good to see. So if you see it's actually running behind where I am. That's the marginal cost curve. So what you've got is the idea that after you reach the point of maximum efficiency, which is at this point here, that's fundamentally we've got the correct ratio of workers to machines. And then if you want to produce more than that amount of output, you've got to add more workers than is ideal for the machine. So what you therefore get is each worker adds more to output, but slightly less than the previous worker. So because you're getting diminishing marginal productivity, you get rising marginal cost. And that's the basic theory. Hence, marginal cost rises. Then they assume, this is not shown in the diagram, but I'll do it here. They assume that the firm cannot affect the market price. So you draw a market price as a horizontal line. So if I started at 60, I'd bring marginal price, I'd bring price horizontally across here. So what it means is the the marginal change to the revenue of the firm is identical to market price. And what that means, you can hear, John, you can hear me now, but you can't interact. So Wi-Fi, oh dear. What do we do, guys? I'm just not sure how to proceed here.
Steve, just keep going. That's me communicating with John. You just keep doing your thing.
Okay. So you've got let's say the price is 60. Then if the price is 60 and you sell one more unit, you get $60 for it. The marginal cost is 60. So at that point, the gap between your total revenue and your total cost is as high as it can be. And therefore, the marginal cost curve is the supply curve for the individual firm. Now, that becomes an essential part of both their micro and their macro, because it's what they're saying is marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Then the gap between revenue and cost of generation is as high as possible. And that also means you get welfare maximizing results out of it. So the marginal cost represents the cost of the next item produced. The price represents the satisfaction that the consumers are getting. So you get the maximum welfare possibility when price equals marginal cost. So, yeah, I'm seeing John's comments. They never used a wired connection before. He has to go and buy an Ethernet cable. Ty, tell him to go shopping at Curry's. Go to Curry's and get an Ethernet cable. Or they'll call it a C45. Plug it into the modem should have a spot there, and hopefully you can fix it up that way.
I'm gonna start a new playlist on my YouTube channel on how to wire your computer up to the internet.
I know. I'm actually using Wi-Fi here, but it's incredibly high quality. Partly the problem, John, is that you're in a lousy country because it's socialist. Okay, you know that England's been run by socialists for the last 40 or 50 years, and those socialists have fucked up the internet. Me, I'm in a capitalist country called Hungary, and they've got a brilliant internet. And that is pretty much what it's like reading a neoclassical textbook. Everything turned upside down. So,
Damn.
anyway,
Shots fired.
Yeah. Okay. Caddy, me. Anyway, this is what they teach. And I want you to take a look at something else as well. See the numbers down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What are we talking about here? 10 units. The firm is actually hitting diminishing marginal productivity at production level of 2. 2 what? How often? Okay. If you were thinking about, if you wanted to do graphs in microeconomics of a firm, then I think you'd imagine producing more than 2 units per year. Your time dimension should be years. Okay. So what the hell is the idea of a production system that can handle 2 units? There's something strange going on there, which is something else I'll happily talk about in a moment.
Can you hear us now, John?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Let's just try to do a few quality tests. John,
Yes.
I'm glad you found yourself a connection to the internet that is suitable.
Yeah, it's a lot of different connections, but found something that fitted. Yeah.
Perfect.
Good. Okay.
So
Well, Ty,
John,
you better take over.
I'm gonna take over here. I'm gonna turn our chat back on. See if we can get this going. We've become very disorganized, but this is a normal theme of our show. Steve, Mike, and Dan, myself wouldn't have it any other way. John Hearn,
it's the charm of the
here he
podcast.
is.
Glad to be here. Having just arrived back from Uzbekistan.
Well, John, I'm really honored that you would actually, take a risk and come on to a mostly post Keynesian show. That kind of shows some true character in yourself. So I just want to put that out there. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I do enjoy going to places where everyone disagrees with me. It's much greater fun than having people agree with me. I was invited to a crypto conference recently to explain why crypto won't work. That was quite an interesting experience.
Well, you know what? I didn't tell Steve and I didn't email you I did actually set up 10 questions, and the way for a debate. Now, the way I did this, to be transparent, is I used Chat GPT. And what I put in Chat GP is I said, make simple debate questions for a neoclassical post Keynesian debate. So
Yeah.
that's how I came up with these questions. And I decided that I would pose the question, 10 of them, and each, both you and Steve have 3 minutes to answer, followed by a very annoying noise on my part.
Yeah.
So one question you would start first. The next question Steve would start first. So it's fair, so you guys can counter each other. And these are not got you questions, John. I know you've put yourself in a vulnerable position by coming on the show. They're just general differences between the two schools, and I think both of you are going to have kind of some fun with it, hopefully. So let's actually kind of start that out. I'm going to kind of put some people in the background. I guess Mike and Daniel, you're going to serve as observers. So at the end of the set of the questions, you guys can give your feedback, and hopefully it's unbiased. I'm going to stay neutral. Sorry, Steve. This is the one time where I'm not going to be bashing neoclassicals along with you. I want this to be fair because, like I said, I'm really happy John's here. I'm going to put some people in the background. Let's put Dan and Mike in the background. I'm going to bring up the first question. I'll get John to chime in first. And it is the fundamental principles of economics. Which perspective, neoclassical or post-Keynesian, provides a more accurate explanation of real-world economic phenomenon, considering the emphasis on markets and individual rationality versus limitations of the market and aggregate demand? John, go ahead first.
So my concern is always with markets and free markets as much as possible, and capitalism, and I don't like intervention, so I'm quite happy to think that markets will work if we have sound regulations. I would only ever have a limited role for government, and I would not be looking for much intervention. For example, it's not possible to manipulate aggregate demand in an economy and create anything other than damage. You need to have sound demand in an economy, which is sound fiscal and monetary policies. And those sound fiscal and monetary policies will create the stability from within which capitalism and free markets work. So, calling me post-Keynesian, I'm not post-Keynesians. Keynesians are wrong. So I've gone down a sort of side road here from Keynesian. And I suppose, yes, I am the original liberal economist. Whether that's neoliberal or not, I don't know. But I don't believe that you can intervene in an economy and produce benefit beyond a very limited provision of public goods and merit goods. That's all governments should ever do, because public goods are what we want and no one will buy them. And merit goods are the two things, education and health, that I would support. And from there, I don't want governments to do anything else, because everything they do is wasteful and inefficient. Do you want me to carry on for 3 minutes, or do you want me to stop when I've said something that I think Steve might like to respond to?
If you think you've articulated the basics of what you want to say, we can just go to Steve and he can go 3 minutes or less. Steve, your response to the question and to John.
Okay. I wouldn't object to neoclassical theory if I thought it actually knew what markets were and got them right in the first instance. My problem with them, they've got a mythical view of how markets actually function and a mythical view of the role of government in that situation as well. So one of their views is, for example, that markets are fundamentally a barter system. And what we're doing behind what they call the veil of money is we're bartering one object for another object, and therefore the monetary system can be largely ignored. Now, when you look at the real world, money is created in two ways. Banks create money by lending out more than they get back in deposits. Governments create money by spending more than they get back in taxation. And if you have the obsession that the neoclassicals have about the government running a balanced budget over time, What that means is you've only got private money creation. And that private money creation by banks ends up putting the non-bank financial, the non-bank private sector into negative equity, because banks, when they lend, they increase the assets of the borrower by giving them a loan. They also, by giving them money, with that money comes a loan. So there's no change in the net equity position of the borrower. And consequently, because the banks have to be in positive equity, the private non-bank sector is in negative equity. And that means, oh dear, I've got more liabilities than I have assets. I'm going to use this borrowed money for the bank to go and speculate on financial assets or non-financial assets. I'm going to buy shares, I'm going to buy a house, and hope the price goes up. And what you get out of that is Ponzi schemes and bubbles. And they're a regular feature of pre-Keynesian capitalism. If you look at the record of the 19th century, you got a bubble and burst every 10 to 15 years, booms and busts. That was when the government was trivially small. So your best picture of what a non-governmental system is like is 19th century capitalism. And in that case, take 19th century America, because at that stage, the government was less than 5% of GDP. You had booms and crashes all the way through. And that was largely because with the private money system, the non-bank system ends up in negative equity. They borrow, they speculate, booms and busts. So the government should be running a deficit. It should be spending more than it gets back in taxation. And the lack of knowledge of neoclassicals about that is what ends up in so many. We've had them causing financial crises by thinking they're going to prevent them. So we got the Great Depression that way. We got the 2007 crash that way. So the government has a positive role, both in providing money that the private sector uses, and as well as what John talked about, the stuff I agree with on in public goods, education, health, largely transport, telecommunications, which of course England does not do well. Those things would be, we'd agree on that particular front, but the government has a role in creating the money that we use for commerce. And if it doesn't do that, you end up in a boom and bust system. Capitalism is not stable, and government can stabilize an unstable system. And that's an essential part of what it should do.
Perfect. So this time I'm going to let you go first and then John can reply. And this is market efficiency. To what extent does the neoclassical assumption of market efficiency hold up in light of financial crises and market imperfections as suggested by Post Keynesian economics?
Yeah, better point out for John's benefit of Post Keynesian means non-neoclassical. So his perspective is neoclassical minus post-Keynesian. Yeah, the market is not efficient. The assumptions necessary to make the neoclassical idea of market efficiency are ludicrous. And this is one thing that I really think neoclassical economics, if you actually study it deeply, not just learn out of the textbooks, but read the original papers, you basically find they're living in a fantasy world. So what's called the efficient markets hypothesis was invented by a guy called John Sharp in the 1950s, 1960s. And Sharp assumed that he worked out a model of how an individual could choose between risky assets, which are shares fundamentally, and a non-risky asset, which were bonds that return a fixed interest rate. And what he had was the return of the asset on the horizontal of a graph, obviously, the vertical being the standard deviation. And you then have a cloud where you have all the shares in the marketplace, IBM, General Motors, Tesla, blah, blah, blah. And you have a combination of the expected return on the share and the expected variation of that return. And then what we call the capital market line for an individual was drawn from the rate they can borrow at up to that cloud. And you get the point of tangency, and that gave you the best combination of risk and return. Now, that worked for a single individual. Of course, the market has more than one person in it. So how did he handle that? He said, I assume homogeneity of investor expectations. Investors were expected to agree on the returns and standard deviations of all shares in the marketplace. Now, that's basically saying, I assume we're all Nostradamus or Jesus Christ. Take your pick. And that we can actually accurately predict the future. And that's the basis of the efficient market hypothesis. It's nonsense. And therefore, we got out of deregulating the markets to make it look like the economic textbook. We got the 87 stock market crash, the 2000 crash, and 2007. So the market is not efficient as neoclassicals define it. And this is where they actually bastardize the word. They're using words. The rest of us think efficient means making transactions quickly. That's what we mean by it. What they mean is the market accurately predicts the future, and it predicts the future accurately because everybody in the market is Nostradamus. Nonsense.
Okay, I'll have this answered and reply, John, to what Steve just said to the question, and kind of expand on market efficiency from your perspective.
Yeah, the important point was there that Steve made a silly assumption, and that silly assumption was because markets are inefficient, that government can do it any better. Markets are inefficient, and governments are even more inefficient. And a good illustration of that would be to go back to something Steve said in his first point, which was there were booms and busts with very limited governments during the 19th century, indeed the 18th century. And there have been booms and busts during this century. And the booms and busts during this century far outweigh the booms and busts of the previous period. The booms and busts under the gold standard were created basically by gold discoveries. And that is that when you discover gold and you run down from those hills and start buying things, the prices go up and the value of gold goes down. So it exhausts the gold where you found it, and it's not worth looking for more gold. Then over a period of time, gold becomes more valuable again, and it's worth going out and looking for it. And someone finds it, and of course they can't keep their mouth shut. They run down and tell everyone they found gold, and it's another rush. So what you find in that century was ups and downs, booms and busts related to monetary growth, faster and slower with gold discoveries. When you come to this century, you've got a situation where governments say, right, we can do this, we can sort this out much better. And you had, let's go after the First World War, you had a great mistake in the UK when the Cunliffe Committee tried to go back to a pre-war gold standard, which meant destroying lots of money. That caused a depression in the UK straight after the First World War. The Americans did all right because they didn't make that silly mistake until it came to the Great Depression, when the Americans actually contracted their monetary system when the Federal Reserve got involved in trying to deal with the Wall Street crash and did it excessively badly. We then go through a period of the gold exchange standard when things were reasonably stable and governments couldn't actually get involved and do much because they had to maintain a fixed exchange rate. You then come to 1970 when Nixon takes us away from that and we get the real introduction of fiat money, and governments say, yeah, we can really get economies growing fast and we can run budget deficits and push money into the economy. And then you get an enormous boom in terms of inflation in the 70s. No growth, of course, but a boom in terms of inflation. That then stabilizes during the 80s. And then we have the problems that we have with the global financial crisis, a big contraction, government mistakes again. ZERPish policies don't work, and the recovery from ZERP is almost as bad as the ZERPish policies in the first place. Zero interest rate policy, when I say ZERPish policy. So what Steve should have said is we need to compare the inefficiency of markets with the inefficiency of government. And if we compare those two things, markets are much more efficient at allocating resources than governments ever are. And many of the things that Steve says has become the result of his drift towards modern monetary theory, which I have spent a long time explaining is fundamentally wrong. And it's not necessary for governments to run deficits, for the private sector to have surpluses. It is quite easy for a system to work where you have balanced budgets and sound monetary policy, and it's always necessary to separate monetary policy from fiscal policy, because governments don't create money when they spend money, they don't destroy money when they tax people. You're looking at the clock, Ty, so shall I stop there?
I hate the annoying sound. You're going to go first on this one, and it's going to be about government intervention. How do you justify the neoclassical stance of minimal government intervention in markets in contrast to post-Keynesian arguments for government intervention during economic downturns in terms of stability and equity? Go ahead.
I forgot the first sentence you said, but I'll do my best. Yes, governments do have to intervene. They do have to intervene because it's necessary that we have the public good. Now, the public good is just something like street lighting. We want it, but we're not prepared to pay for it because we can't exclude other people from using it. So we need a provision by government of these public goods. They don't do it well, but no one else will do it. So government has got to buy these. They don't have to produce them, but they've got to buy the public good. Then, as I say, the merit goods, which are the goods that will be underconsumed in a marketplace, education and health being the big examples, need support by government. But then past that point, you don't need any further government intervention. And a lot of things that Steve will say, a few things I've set him up now, is that there's such a thing as an output gap in the economy, and it's governments who are necessary to close those output gaps by manipulating aggregate demand. I've never seen any examples of an output gap being closed by manipulating aggregate demand. The only way to close output gaps is on the supply side of the economy, that is deciding what caused the output gap and then dealing with those issues. So governments can't manipulate demand, close output gaps. Governments do cause, well, are the only cause of inflation. So Steve might like to put me right on that, but things like wage rises and energy prices and Ukraine wars, none of those things affect inflation. They change prices in individual markets. The only thing that creates inflation is monetary mismanagement. And it's the monetary mismanagement by government intervention over the last century that has caused all the ups and downs and booms and busts. And it's almost a single cause of booms and busts is governments interfering, government intervention. Governments don't understand what they're doing. They're political units that are just concerned with talking to people and telling them what they want to hear so that they'll vote for them and then hope that they never have to justify any of the things that they said they were going to do.
Very nice.
I'll leave you with that, Ty.
All right, Steve, same question and comment on what John said.
Can I do a bit of screen sharing here
No,
on that particular? I
no,
can't.
just,
Okay.
No, we got to keep this fair, Steve, because I don't think he's prepared anything.
No, then in fact, I think this is actually where I think Jovian said it a short while ago. He's just making this stuff up. And that's the trouble, because when you look at the data, it contradicts what John's saying about what causes booms and busts and what creates money. So I'm looking at a graph which I'd like to share of this relationship between booms and busts in the economy and creation of private money, not government money, but private money. And the correlation is so extreme between unemployment and credit that it looks like a Rorschach plot. Those are people old enough to remember the idea of a Rorschach plot to checking your personality. You throw a lamp of ink on a page of blotting paper, fold it over, and you get a pattern which is symmetrical. And that's what you then interpretation that's supposed to give you your personality. That's what unemployment versus credit looks like. Credit goes up, unemployment goes down. Credit goes down, unemployment goes up. It is entirely driven by the private sector's instability, not by the government. And this is, again, when you look at the data going back 200 years, every financial crisis we've had was caused by private money creation, not by government money creation. So John is living in a fantasy world. And this is what I find irritating about neoclassical theory in general. When you check the data, you find something which is the opposite of what they say. If he was right, every financial crisis would have been caused by government spending. Every financial crisis is in fact caused by private money creation. And that's why we need, in a lot of ways, government money to try to counteract what the private sector does in extreme excesses. And one of the great problems of neoclassical economics is that it ends up leading to the system being more unstable than it would be without the anti-interventions they do of trying to get the government to run a budget surplus which actually forces people into the private sector and leads to a private sector bubble. That's what happened in the 1920s. During the 1920s, and this is actually a way of contrasting John's arguments, during the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge ran a surplus of 1% of GDP every year. And during that time, he reduced the level of government debt from 30% of GDP to 15% of GDP. And he was convinced, as he said in his 1928-29, given a 1929 State of the Union address, he said, this is the foundation of stability. It must be continued. We got the Great Depression the next year. And it was really the private sector. People went, when the government was trying to reduce its debt, people were increasing their private debt by 5 times as much as the government was reducing its. That led to the debt bubble that caused the Great Depression. So this stuff it's a fantasy world to say that the government causes instability. It's the private sector that does it. You need the counteracting behavior of the government to avoid us falling into a debt deflation.
Very nice. I think at the end of the questions, we can suss out a little more stuff, put on some screen shares and stuff, but we'll just keep the questions rolling. You're first again on this one. It is monetary policy. I don't actually like how ChatGPT framed the question, but we'll put it out there. Which approach, neoclassical emphasis on strict monetary policy rules or post-Keynesian focus on managing interest rates and employment, is more effective in managing economic stability? Don't like the framing of the question, but there it is, Steve.
Yeah, well, chuck out the interest rate. That's ChatGPT not knowing it's Post Keynesian Economics. So it's just a government running government money creation and government spending to counteract downturns caused by a private sector debt crisis. So that is far more likely to lead to stability, but what it can also lead is encouraging the private sector to continue going back into debt again. And that's what actually happened after the 87 crash. Again, can I do a screen share or not?
No, we'll wait till the end of the questions.
Okay. So what you've got is private debt continued growing. And this actually I blame on neoclassical economists, because they don't understand the importantly destabilizing effect of private debt. So when you have a private debt bubble going on, that will lead to a boom and a bust, and then the government's behavior counteracts that. The trouble is, this is actually, I blame neoclassicals for this particular problem. If you had post-Keynesians in control, they were trying to stop private debt bubbles forming in the very first place. So a huge part of our crises were caused by neoclassical economics, emphasis on strict monetary policy, ignoring what happens with the private sector. We then get a private sector debt bubble that causes a crash. Then the government comes in and tries to counteract it, but doesn't reduce the level of private debt. So we continue going further and further into a bubble. And that's what gave us the 2007 crisis. So it's a very difficult question to answer, in the sense that a lot of the instability came from neoclassical economics during a period that people thought Keynesians were in control of the economy.
John, I'll get you to reply and expand onto the question of monetary policy.
Yeah, okay. Monetary policy is the most important policy that governments can manage, because we do need sound money. You get sound money, you don't get inflation. You don't get inflation, then prices work properly, going up and down to reallocate resources in the economy dependent upon customers' demands for goods and services. Now, what Steve ran past quite quickly was trying to relate the Wall Street crash to the Great Depression. They're actually two different things. The Wall Street crash was caused exactly as Steve described, and it was people speculating, people borrowing, and the Bank of the United States was particularly involved in lending rather a lot of money to people to speculate, because if you borrow money, see share prices going up, it's very tempting to borrow a lot more and keep that bubble going. That then led to the Wall Street crash. The response of that was for the Bank of the United States to have liquidity problems. And they went to the Federal Reserve, which had only been set up in 1913 and didn't really know what it was doing, and wanted to have liquidity support. And the Federal Reserve said no. That meant the Bank of the United States collapsed, and then banks across America started collapsing, because people who had bank accounts thought it was better to take their money out of banks and put it under the bed rather than leave it in those banks that were likely to collapse. And you had a 30% contraction in monetary demand across America, which was the Great Depression. The Great Depression was caused by government, the Federal Reserve, mismanaging money after the Wall Street crash. And that's exactly what happens when monetary policy is bad, if you like. And I see very little good examples of sound monetary policy whenever governments get involved. If you go back to the 1970s is a great example, because the Keynesian economists came out of the gold exchange standard saying that, look, give us a chance. If we can expand aggregate demand faster under fiscal policy and have a nice accommodating monetary policy, we'll grow the economy by much faster rates than it's previously grown. So as soon as you go off the gold exchange standard, that opportunity was there. So lots of money was pumped into the economy, fiscal deficits were run, and all it did was cause inflation and cause economic growth to contract. And the important thing really that Steve and I should be considering is what causes economies to grow, what causes economic growth. And economic growth comes with strict, sound monetary policy. Now that's not contractions and expansions, it's expanding monetary policy carefully in a controlled way. If you like, the simple rule is you expand monetary demand slightly faster than the expected rate of growth of output. And the governments through fiscal and monetary policy can do that, but they don't do it because there's this political interference and economists like Steve telling them no problems, you can always spend more money. And when you spend more money, you do grow the economy, you create demand, and that's incorrect because governments, money expands and contracts in a totally different way from the way that MMT and Steve think. It's not anything to do with taxation, that doesn't destroy money. It's nothing to do with government spending, that doesn't create money. We don't need public sector deficits for private sector surpluses and vice versa. So there are sectoral balances within the economy, usually illustrated between domestic policy and exchange rates.
Next question, John. Thank you for that in-depth response. This is going to be on fiscal policy. I'll get you to start first. In addressing economic downturns and income inequality, should governments follow the neoclassical approach of caution with deficits or the post-Keynesian approach of active fiscal policy, including deficit spending? Go ahead.
Right, you meant fiscal policy, not physical policy. So you're talking about fiscal policy being governments manipulating aggregate demand. The simple Keynesian explanation of things, which has been picked up by MMT, is that you can deficit spend and you can grow an economy. And if it became a little overheated, you could rein it back by increasing taxation and moving back towards a surplus situation. And that should stabilize, grow the economy, create full employment. It does none of those things. And in fact, attempting to do those things often increases income inequality, as has been the case really since the global financial crisis, when we've had this income inequality growing, mainly because of zero interest rate policies, which have reduced productive investment and made it profitable for people who are wise, know what they're doing, to go out there and speculate in markets where there are assets growing. Quite simply, if you put interest rates back towards zero, there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and asset prices. Asset prices go up. If you know that, you get into buying assets and buying second-hand assets, which is nothing to do with productive investment in the economy. Income inequality is necessary, but income inequality goes down under markets. Free market capitalism is the best way to create more income equality. That is, children look at a situation and see that there are ways of making money by becoming chartered accountants when their father used to be a road sweeper, and people grow looking for the things that will make them more money into the future. And income, let's not confuse as well. You said income inequality, great. Let's forget about wealth inequality. That really doesn't matter at all. It's totally insignificant. What does matter is income inequality, and free markets deal with income inequality much better than governments trying to intervene. They've done terrible things in terms of creating more inequality over the last 20 years. I'm sure Steve would agree with that one.
All right, we'll get Steve's response to the question.
Well, of course,
Steve.
I don't agree with that. The inequality has been caused by destroying trade unions, which is a major part of what neoclassical economics did, believing that if you get rid of trade unions, you'll get a better marketplace for labour. What actually had you reduce the capacity of workers to bargain, and that's where the massive increase in inequality has come from, fundamentally. And Piketty, and I'm no particular fan of Piketty's book, but his data is pretty categorical on that front. The level of inequality now is virtually the greatest in human history. And again, this is why I find arguing with people who believe economics textbooks so frustrating, because if you look at the data, it contradicts their arguments. This is the most unequal period in the history of human civilization, pretty much. With Piketty's work and other work by people specializing in analyzing inequality, the only time I think is comparable, you've got to go back to the pharaohs to find a level of wealth and income inequality that compares to what we have today. That's where a huge part of the frustration people have about modern capitalism is the sheer inequality between the haves and the have-nots. It's gigantic. So to say it's less now is just crazy. But that, unfortunately, when you're reading out of an economics textbook, that's what people end up believing. Saying it doesn't matter, it's probably the most important issue. And one ironic thing about this is the neoclassicals, in their theory of consumption, don't have any idea of income distribution. We have isolated consumers, maximizing utility, no picture to how people make their incomes or not. That then means, and most neoclassicals aren't aware of this, you can't even derive a market demand curve from individual demand curves. You get a curve that goes all over the place because they leave out income inequality. So the neoclassicals are the worst people on the planet for being able to talk about what causes inequality, because their own models themselves can't even cope with the existence of inequality. So this is one of the enormous disconnects between neoclassical theory and the real world. And in that case, back to the deficit spending. Deficit spending is necessary, but not sufficient. The thing they've ignored again is the runaway level of private debt. And if you let that happen, you're going to end up with a disaster at the same time, which is what we've done. So it's an incomplete. We don't have post-Keynesians in charge. We have post-Keynesians standing outside screaming at neoclassicals who are actually running the economy. And that's one of the ironic thing. John thinks his side of economics is not in control. Ever since 1975, fundamentally, neoclassical economists have been running the show.
Very good. I'd like to just thank everybody in the chat right now on YouTube. Make sure you hit that like button. Subscribe to the Prof. Steve Keen channel if you haven't subscribed yet. Everybody watching live on Twitter, or now X, formerly known as Twitter, hit that like button, repost, then come over here, join the chat. I'm going to go to the next question here. It'll be Steve first. It's on income distribution. How does neoclassical economics address income inequality, and does it sufficiently account for its impact on economic stability compared to the post-Keynesian perspective that highlights income disparities? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, John pretty much answered the first part of that question quite accurately a moment ago, saying he thinks wealth inequality doesn't matter and income inequality matters a bit, but not a great deal. It is just absolutely fundamental to the problems of capitalism. And income inequality is something that happens in all societies. If you take a look at the distribution of income in virtually every society, you find what's called a power law. And that is a very natural phenomenon. Earthquakes are distributed by a power law. Every evolution itself generates power law distributions in terms of number of species and size and so on. And what that gives you is if you plot the log of income on one scale and the log of the number of people who've got that income on a vertical, you get a straight line. Now, going down this way, pardon me. Now, that is just the natural inequality of an evolutionary system. What we've had with neoclassical saying, don't worry about the inequality, is we've had, I think, a super increase in the level of inequality. So, and that is a large part of where the instability and indeed social instability comes from these days, because so many people at the bottom are barely surviving. People in gig economy jobs, 2 and 3 jobs, 0-hour contracts, all this sort of stuff. That's what was done to workers during the period of destroying trade unions. And again, when government's spending is constrained, that doesn't mean Rupert Murdoch can't afford to go to hospital. Okay, he can buy the hospital if he wants to. It's the people who are down the poor end of the scale who can't afford the operations, can't afford the even to go and see the doctor. And then you get the reduction in government services, which is one thing John supports for health, ends up causing a large part of the inequality. We've got far too much inequality in capitalism, and neoclassical economics is largely responsible for how extreme it's become.
We'll get John to reply. John, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Steve fell straight into the trap at the beginning by mentioning Piketty, because wealth inequalities and income inequalities are two totally different things. And it's often the case where people will go, the world is very unequal in terms of wealth distribution, therefore we've got to redistribute income. That's incorrect. And as I say, I wouldn't even look at wealth inequalities. I don't think that's important. You look at income inequalities. That's what's important. And therefore, you do want to deal with the problem of income inequality. I take up the point also that Steve mentioned about private debt and public debt. Private debt is a problem. Public debt is an even bigger problem. Private debt's a problem because there are people who have now find themselves with the reversal of ZERP policies into higher interest rates, who are likely to go bankrupt, unable to finance their mortgages. So that is a problem. And private sector debts are distributed right the way through the economy. Some people can deal with them, some people can't deal with them. And because they're very diverse, they can be looked at, and people who are in trouble can be helped. Public sector debt is all in one place, and public sector debt, when that gets out of control, then you have a real problem. You're looking at a situation now, so I'm told, I know Steve likes his numbers and he might like to correct me, but in the UK, I think we've got a national debt of 2.58 trillion, and we've got next year to spend 110 billion pounds just servicing that debt, which is all money that could have been much better used by government, not building up that debt over the last 20 years and releasing it, leaving it in the private sector, where people could have borrowed that money and productively invested in producing real jobs, not just making themselves rich by trading and in and out of asset markets. Anyone could have become rich if they understood ZERPish policies, because anyone straight after the global financial crisis that saw interest rates go down to almost zero would have jumped into all asset classes which are not newly created assets, they're just old assets that continue to go up in value. And those people have become very wealthy as the result of knowing what to do. Now, you can attack their incomes. That's how you get income inequality down. Forget the wealth. The fact, who wants to be wealthy? Who wants to have a great big castle and think of the heating bill and looking after it? You don't worry about wealth. You worry about income inequality. And there are things that you can do with income inequality to make it a much fairer distribution. And taxation policy can do that, and government spending can do that. But government's fiscal policy and monetary policies haven't done that. They created the very environment in which people could become rich by investing in things which were unproductive, namely second-hand assets.
All right. Thank you, John. So we're going to go into the next question. The last 4 questions here, we're going to narrow it down to 2 minutes, just so we have some time to talk after the pseudo debate we're doing here. So it's going to be on financial regulation. What should be the appropriate level of financial regulation to ensure both stability and innovation, considering the post-Keynesian emphasis on regulation to prevent systematic crisis and the neoclassical preference for deregulation? Go ahead, John.
Right, financial regulations, they're an enormous quantity and variety of financial regulations. And unfortunately, it's a saying of, in some areas we need more financial regulation, in some areas we've got too much financial regulation, and in other areas we might have got it right. The PRA of the Bank of England deals with financial regulation, and financial regulation is essential. And it's not essential to actually to take things away through financial regulation. As with all regulations, it's to create free competition and the level playing field, if you like, so that no one has an advantage or a disadvantage. No one has insider knowledge. Everyone is in the right and the same situation. Now, financial regulation then deals with individual markets and deals obviously with banks and financial markets. Overall regulation, as far as I'm concerned, it's quite straightforward, and the very opposite of what Steve would want is that we just need a situation where I would have the Bank of England regulated in such a way that it is unable to influence interest rates at all. It cannot manipulate interest rates. All it's got to do is manage inflation and keep inflation at 2% or below. And the best way that can happen is if the government is using a balanced budget approach to its fiscal policy until its debt levels fall considerably below what they are now.
You're muted, Ty.
You can go ahead, Steve.
I'm looking at the data for the USA right now, which is probably the best one to look at. And in virtually every country in the world, private debt is far higher than government debt. This is the thing which, again, neoclassical economics lives in a data-free world. They make claims about how dangerous government debt is. You'd think of looking at it, well, that would mean the one that's rising most and highest is government debt, but no, it's not. In every bloody country except, I think, Greece and one other, where they're constrained by paying part of the euro, private debt is far higher than government debt. So it's private debt that causes the bubbles and the crises, not government debt. It's the opposite. And with regulation, I'd be regulating the level of private debt. I'd be trying to stop private debt bubbles forming. In a major way, private debt is higher than government debt. Lol, says Ralph G. Okay, at the moment, private debt in the government debt in America is 110% of GDP, and private debt is 155% of GDP. I think 155 is bigger than 110. Correct me if I'm wrong. So again, people think what they think is the opposite of the data. Okay, if you look at the data, and that's one thing which Post Keynesian is very much grounded in information and real data. The neoclassical ideas are just arse about tit, to use an Australian expression. Now, I'd be regulating, but I'd be regulating the level of private debt. I'd stop the private sector lending too much. And part of the way to do that is to have more government money creation. And the government creates money by running a deficit, by spending more than it gets back in taxation. It doesn't borrow from the private sector. It creates assets, financial assets for the private sector. That's the real world. And again, John is arguing a very interesting fantasy, but it ain't the real world.
All right, next question. A long-term growth. I'll get you to start first here. Bring it up here. How do neoclassical and post-Keynesian's perspective accommodate for long-term economic growth while addressing short-term fluctuations and crisis? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, first off, I have to say we have to give up the obsession with growth. We're going to be looking at degrowth to try to get back within planetary boundaries, which we're not going to do. And I think in that sense, I blame neoclassical economics for encouraging far too much economic growth, far more than the planet can cope with. And it's actually going to destroy capitalism at some point when the ecology just goes too crazy for us to maintain sedentary civilizations. But fundamentally, post-Keynesian economics expects capitalism to be unstable. It expects it to be cyclical. And the idea which Minsky put best was that you should have the government behaving in such a way as to stabilize an unstable system. And that's by both counter-cyclical government spending, but also by preventing private debt bubbles, which we haven't done. We've done the counter-cyclical, we haven't done the anti-private debt bubbles. So we've ended up with not the worst of both worlds, but and they say we can't have capitalism. We certainly can't have private sector profit making. And that's when we start seeing this decline, we're going to have government money creation because the private sector won't be able to. So that's a rather different question. I doubt the ChatGPT is asking anything on ecology, unfortunately. But that's the major issue. By being obsessed with growth, which neoclassicals are obsessed with growth, we've ended up exceeding what the planet can cope, and we're going to have degrowth whether you want it or not. That, to me, is the main factor we're facing today.
You're
Yeah,
muted.
I'm muted again. I'm trying to be quiet for you guys, as I'm not visiting. I want to get involved in this because I love economics. I love all sides. I love hearing all perspectives. John, long-term growth, your counter to Steve, and expand on it for me.
Yeah, a quick counter to Steve first, because he said 110% is smaller than 155%, which is quite right, and I agree with him entirely. But what you have to think about is 155% of private debt is distributed across millions of people, whereas 110% of government debt is only in one area. That's why that's the problem, and private sector debt isn't the problem. Now, going to economic growth is essential, and economic growth actually means using the same amount of resources to produce more. That's how economies grow. They use the same amount of resources to produce more. Bright ideas, innovators, entrepreneurs, these are the people who actually make us better off over the longer term. Short-term fluctuations, you can grow an economy which is not economic growth. So just pumping money into an economy and, say, employing a lot of people, going out and sweeping the roads or whatever it is you want to do, is not economic growth. That might cause a growth of income. Often it's swallowed up in terms of inflation. That's not economic growth. Economic growth happens in capitalist free markets where entrepreneurs have the opportunity to have ideas, and if they get those ideas wrong, they go out of business and they're bankrupt. If they get those ideas right, the rest of us are much better off. If government try and do this and they get it wrong, they don't go out of business. They just pump more money into getting it wrong and more money to getting it wrong, and so it goes on. So you don't want government involved in trying to grow economies. They have no idea how to grow economies. The only way economies grow is through free market capitalism, not government intervention.
Thanks, John. We're on our final two questions. The next one I'll get you to start with is global trade. So promoting international trade and safeguarding domestic economies, how should the balance be struck, considering the neoclassical support for free trade and globalization versus the post-Keynesian concerns about economic instability? Go ahead, John.
That's the really big problem, because if you proceed down the avenue that I've been going, if you like, you would like free market capitalism to exist across the world, and for governments not to be involved, and for a businessman in one country to contact a businessman in another country and say, I wish to buy your, and we'll set up a nice trade. That's what you want, but of course you haven't got that. You've got some countries which try and promote freer trade, and other countries which are very restrictive in the way that they trade. And that's very difficult, because if you've got one country, if you like, not playing the game and creating level playing fields between competing firms, and other countries trying to do that, then you have real problems. And this is an area in which globalization should be involved in trying to create the level playing field across the world. So I don't like, for example, let's look at the EU. I was definitely for Brexit in terms of the theoretical move towards creating freer trade. What you had was a situation where, when we joined the European Economic Community, we did it to free up trade, which is exactly what happened, and things improved from 1973 in the UK for a period of time, until we moved towards a political union. And as soon as we moved towards an economic political union, then you got all the interference and all the things which disturbed trade, and are still disturbing trade now, because the bureaucrats and the politicians want to prove they were right. We should never have left the EU, and therefore they're putting every possible restriction they can to restrict trade, just to show us that it was much better if they were managing this, rather than allowing markets to work and businessmen to interact and trade with each other without interference by border control, if you like.
Thanks, John. Steve, your response.
I wrote a little satire about Ricardo and comparative advantage in a little book called Economics, which I'd recommend people to take a look at for the sheer fun of it, because this whole idea that trade is what promotes growth is wrong-headed. The countries which have actually succeeded in growing most rapidly were those which protected their economies for a while, but also forced their firms to improve their technology and catch up most rapidly. That's Stanley Roddick's research that shows that. You look at South Korea, Japan, Germany, the country which grew rapidly in the post-war period, they all went through a protectionist phase, and that includes America in the 19th century as well. So what it promotes growth is not trade and specialization, but investment. And the countries that grow most rapidly, and this is work which you can find in the Atlas of Economic Complexity that Harvard University maintains, the countries that have the most successful performance in terms of growth and welfare in their economies as well have diversified economies. They don't have specialized economies. So the whole idea about free trade, globalization, and specialization is simply empirically hasn't worked, and it doesn't work because it amplifies the idea of reallocating resources more efficiently, when what really matters is creating new resources via investment. And you can't reallocate resources from one industry to another unless you can tell me how you can turn a blast furnace into a sheep dip.
Thanks, Steve. So we are at the final question. I saved the best for last. Economic modeling. Here's the question. Which approach, Neoclassical's reliance on mathematical models and equilibrium analysis, or Post Keynesian's use of dynamic and historical methods, is better suited to capture the complexity of the real-world economies? Go ahead, Steve.
Well, definitely the post-Keynesian dynamic and historical. This is one thing that I find so frustrating about neoclassicals. They talk about capitalism as having a tendency towards equilibrium, when that's the last thing which capitalism is characterized by. It's incredibly unstable, but some of that instability is the creativity that John talks about, which is correct. Capitalism is the second best social system we've ever had for promoting innovation. The best was our early Cro-Magnon tribal societies. That's where real innovation really occurred initially. But capitalism promotes more growth than socialism does. It creates more growth than feudalism ever did. So the innovation is the main feature that capitalism has. And neoclassical theory, talking about equilibrium, is by far the least genuine characteristic of a capitalist economy. So we need to be modeling it as a dynamic, historical, evolutionary system. Neoclassical economics is closer to that, far closer than neoclassicals, which with their fantasy about equilibrium ends up being an anti-evolutionary theory, when capitalism, if it's anything at all, is an evolutionary system.
Thanks, Steve. John, your response, economic modeling. Go ahead.
Well, mathematical modeling, economic modeling, particularly bad. Mathematical modeling, I'm not a great fan of. There's some very simple rules to follow. And unfortunately, we do have lots of people with lots of ideas about how they create models for the economy. And you can understand why mathematicians think they can bring the economy down to a series of equations. Physicists think they can bring the economy down to energy distribution. Engineers think they can bring the economy down to a machine and see how it circulates. Biologists think they can make the economy a body and show how all the blood flows around that body. Accountants produce models based upon digits, bean counting around the world, and all of them are basically wrong because the economists are wrong. The economists have been particularly bad in the way that they've described macroeconomics is the area, because that's where the models are in macroeconomics. They've done a really bad job, which has opened up the door to lots of crazy ideas about mathematical modeling that might make things better. And they don't, because it's the assumptions that these models are built on that are wrong. Assumptions like you can't close output gaps by manipulating demand. You should have a market rate of interest, not a zero rate of interest. Control the quantity of money and monetary demand, and indeed understand what the quantity of money and monetary demand is. Control inflation. Inflation is very easy to control because there's only one cause, and you can control that simply. Those are all the things that you want to do So I would deal with individual problems. I'd not try and produce a mathematical model for the economy, because it just misleads, doesn't work. And we need to get back to really understanding some simple economics, and that's where I like to encourage people to understand economics from the bottom up, not from a complex world down. You look at the world, very complex, trying to understand that, very difficult. Go back to simple models and build up, and then people start to understand how economies work, and we might get some sensible solutions to the world's problems. You're muted.
Well, that was fun. I was actually very honored to have two men that have devoted a great number of years to studying economics. I'm going to bring in Dan. I'm going to bring in Mike. We're going to get your guys' opinions. But first, Dan, I'm going to get you to do the list this week. Top chatters, top chatters, and top commenters. This is why I get other people to read the list. Here it is. You are muted, Dan. Hold on. Let me.
And that's it. We did it. Okay. Come on. Where's the people on the couch? All right.
They're coming.
Do it again.
They're coming.
Do it again. Okay. Tom Roberts, Ghost on the Half Shell, WWE Fan 0104, Code Fan, Lana Dell, Hates the Clock, Dr. or Dregai, James, AJ, Web Freaks, Lost Adult, Ura Jojo. I know that's wrong. Tony Wilson.
Boy, Dan.
I know I'm going down.
You know what? You know what's coming.
Yeah, I know. Mugo Mungai, Cody Pearson, Multi Euro X, and Michael D'Souza Cruz.
Jeez, I should have got Mike to read them.
Yeah,
I'm not sure it would have been much better.
Yeah, judging from last week. Yeah. But again, I should declare this is why I don't read them. Mike, I'll get your thoughts first on what you heard. Anything that kind of stands out on what either John or Steve said?
Oh, I got a bunch of things that were triggered in my little pea brain as I was listening to these great thinkers. I'm going to start with something I want to ask Steve. As we all know, he does not care for neoclassical economics and points out all of the sort of unrealistic assumptions about, you know, the way the real world works versus what's in the theory. But might it not be that, first of all, their models are not real. So criticizing something that's not real by saying your assumptions is not real seems like a logical fallacy. Moreover, isn't it possibly true that neoclassical economics theory is more like parables, like Jesus offering, you know, the story of the prodigal son? It didn't really happen, but it was a way to pass along some basic ideas.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it is a system of parables. And but the thing is, the parables are based on fallacies at the same time. So a bit like telling you that if you want to go to the promised land, you should go to the desert immediately. It's the opposite of what the good advice should be. And that's what worries me about this, that it's a set of parables which, to quote from the old humorist mention, they're neat, they're plausible, and they're wrong. And the trouble is they are such convincing and seductive fallacies that people end up having a utopian view of capitalism, a utility maximizing, cost minimizing, barter system, where if you don't have the government, it works better, et cetera, et cetera. All these things are fantasy views of the real system. And what they end up doing is allowing things like incredible financial instability to build up and incredible accumulation of wealth, which, I'm sorry, John, matters a great deal. That inequality is partly where both the stagnation has come from, the fact that we've got the wrong resources when we need to just start deindustrializing. We've got too many bloody yachts around the damn planet, too many private planes, not enough engineers, not enough capacity to build the systems we need. All those things are a result of following parables that are internally inconsistent about a fantasy world that we don't live in, and we're going to pay a huge price for that.
So to John, I think I'd ask the following. This leaped to mind that when income inequality was mentioned, and you suggested it was a bit of a problem, might it be caused primarily by globalization and free trade, the ability for firms to offshore their to cheaper labor, their production processes, and hence that kind of destroys not only union power, as Steve mentioned, but the middle class in general, so that you have lots of low income gig economy workers on the one hand, and then of course the very wealthy people, and the traditional middle class is slowly withering away.
Yeah, income inequality is probably the most important thing that you want to observe over time. And both Steve and I agree that it's grown considerably in the last 20 years. And to my mind, it has grown considerably because you've created a situation where people can make themselves rich by not actually doing anything productive. If you look, over the centuries at capitalism, then that's the very thing that created more equality. The best example of understanding this, I think, is to look at the communist revolution, the Russian revolution, the Chinese revolution, because the Communist Party came into power to create equality, and they did it straight away, overnight. They created equality, but they created equality of wealth. They did nothing to do with income. And what I mean by that is that they said that no one can own anything privately. We all own everything. We're now all equal overnight. But unfortunately, we don't all have equal access to those resources. So there's some special people who will live in the big houses. They're usually politicians and people who've got to chat with people abroad. And there are resources that are in short supply. So some people will be given vouchers to get those resources, and others have to queue for hours to get those resources. That tried to create equality, and what it did was create a permanent inequality in those countries, which is why they collapse. So trying to intervene and create equality doesn't work. It's capitalism that actually creates equality. I ask all my undergraduates, I say, do you want to be better off than your parents? And almost everyone does, not of course everyone, because some parents are very rich, but they're all looking up and saying they've gone into this area because they can see opportunities and they can see things where they can become much better off than the life that they have lived so far. So equality is actually created in that way of people being entrepreneurs, trying to achieve, trying to make themselves better off, get better qualifications. It's nothing to do with governments trying to make things more equal. And the communist revolutions were great examples of governments creating wealth inequality overnight and putting in income inequality fixed in the system so that it could never really change.
I want to just get to some of the questions from the audience. We've got one here from WWE fan, a question for John, then we'll get Steve to kind of reply too. Would love to hear from John, John's thoughts on the non-accelerating inflation rate, unemployment, NURU, and what he would define full employment as being. John, can you add something to that question?
Yeah, the NERU was just really an attempt to try and deal with the Phillips curve that didn't actually work. So it's the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which was thought to be around 2 or 3%. And there's no such thing as full employment. That's another sort of Keynesian myth. You can say it's 2%, it's 2.5%, it's 3%. And from my point of view, you look at the natural level of unemployment. The natural level of unemployment varies from one country to another, depending upon the institutional factors in those countries. You know, if you have one country that's got a great welfare system, unemployment settles at a much higher level. If you have a country with no welfare system in place, then unemployment is at a very low level because there's nothing to protect you. So this just varies from country to country. And if you have a stable fiscal and monetary policy, you should settle at the highest level of employment, which is the natural level of employment. During the 60s and so, the natural level of employment and the full employment target were about the same. That's why Keynesians seemed to achieve it. After the 70s, the gap grew. The natural level of unemployment grew much higher. In one instance, because of the trade union movement, Steve, I'm sorry to say, they became much more powerful and created much more unemployment, because at the end of the day, wage increases don't cause inflation, they cause unemployment, if they're going to cause anything. So I have no full employment targets. I have an understanding of a natural level of unemployment, and the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment you can really forget about if you replace it with a natural level of unemployment.
Steve, what do you got to say?
Capitalism doesn't have a natural rate. Again, this is an equilibrium way of thinking about the system. It certainly has a cyclical dynamic to it. And if you look at the data of countries with welfare systems like the Scandinavian and Nordic systems, they had lower levels of unemployment than you had in America, which was, if anything, close to free market capitalism. It's America. Again, the data is the opposite of what you claim, John. So system it's cyclical. I don't worry about the cycles themselves. I worry about the impact they have on people who's forced into unemployment through no fault of their own. That's why I'd be in favour of things like a job guarantee and universal basic income and so on, to mean that when unemployment rises, the poor don't suffer as much as they do without those elements. But it's a fundamentally cyclical system. I don't think you can't get rid of cycles. Trying to get rid of cycles is like trying to stop people having circadian rhythms. You can do that by killing them and freezing them to absolute zero. That way they'll stop having cycles. Same thing for an economy. It's inherently cyclical. And that cyclicality is actually part of its strength in many, many ways. Capitalism, as I said, is the second most innovative system we've ever had. It's fundamentally ends up being cyclical because of it. And the thing is, you have to make sure those cycles don't damage people who are basically passengers in the system, which are the workers, rather than the drivers who are capitalists. So I want to see reducing the capacity for financial instability, eliminating the bubbles that the private sector generates by progressing too much debt. Those things I want to do, but I'd never believe you get have a natural rate of anything. You're going to have a varying rate of unemployment because of the booms and bust in technology, as you were saying yourself a while ago. I think on that front, the Schumpeterian stuff makes far more sense than certainly neoclassicals, but also a lot of post Keynesian work. And that cyclicality is part of any living dynamics evolutionary system. So get away from this whole idea of a natural anything. There ain't nothing natural. Everything is cyclical. We're not in an equilibrium system. We're in a far from equilibrium one. And thinking that we're in equilibrium is where a lot of the errors and nonsense of neoclassical and Austrian economics has come from.
Dan, I kind of want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the debate you heard? Any questions for either Steve or John on it? Dan's muted. Let's bring Dan. Let's give some audio to Dan.
I do have some sympathies for both sides. I think I lean a little bit more towards Steve's side, as probably everybody knows. But where are my differences? And I say, well, where's this idea of equilibrium come from? And I'm going to go back to Plato, where Plato, in the Republic, he's basically in an ideal state, right? And literally a state, like a community, a polis of maximum 10,000 people. He's saying you want to imagine the state as if it was an ideal person, right? So I think that's where this assumption of moving to some sort of state of equilibrium originates from. And now, if the economic professors in this room say, well, okay, I don't get that, I don't understand that, I would really like you guys to look at Antonio Damasio's work of homeostasis. Okay, this is evident in every instance of living biology, of moving towards some sort of equilibrium. Okay, now it may seem I'm going against Steve here, and I'm really not. I'm saying that at the aggregate, the entity that we envision as an economic system, we have to detach ourselves from the Platonic ideal that the state or the polis is actually a representative of something like a living organism. And I think that's the part that we have to have the discussion about and look at that from first principles and say, wait a minute, we've gotten this far by giving us this heuristic, as Mike was explaining. It does intuitively make sense, okay? Biological systems do move towards equilibrium. That doesn't mean that economic systems aggregate in that particular fashion. And I think this is a state of wonder, which is a starting point of philosophy to say, wow, isn't that amazing that at an aggregate, the behavior actually ends up being something that is not moving towards equilibrium. That's an interesting idea. Mike.
So just a quick point. So when we talk about homeostasis, we're talking about negative feedback loop processes like a thermostat or cruise control on a car. But if you study complex systems analysis, you also know that delays in the corrective action of a negative feedback loop process, a homeostasis process, cause oscillations, the cyclicality that Steve was alluding to a moment ago. In other words, by the time the corrective action arrives, because of all the delays, it's too much or too little, and the system will oscillate.
And I think homeostasis is not a system of equilibrium. I think this is one of the flaws in thinking that way. But for example, we're obviously biological creatures, and we're generally in a state of homeostasis. Well, we're not in a state of equilibrium. At the moment, because I'm approaching, what is it now, 8 o'clock here, I'm getting close to my circadian rhythm telling me to go to sleep. You guys have just had breakfast. Your rhythm's pushing you forward. Everything is cyclical. And that's what I find so delusional about the neoclassical approach, and it infects everybody, even those that think they're not mathematical modelers. This belief in equilibrium is a desirable state. And as I used to say to my students, the only way you can achieve equilibrium is not only to be dead, but to be dead and frozen to absolute zero. Then you won't change, okay? But anything above that, you're going to change. And change and evolution is the fundamental characteristic of living systems, and it's the fundamental extended characteristic of capitalism as well. And by continuing to treat it as if we can model as an equilibrium system, we massively mislead ourselves about the nature of the system and how to manage it. And that's where enormous errors have come from, not just from neoclassicals, but also from so-called Keynesians. So we accept that it's cyclical, accept that happens, know that there are positive feedbacks as well as negative, as Mike is saying, know that there's evolutionary change as well. And there's also potentially cancer, and that's the financial system. And the main thing that's happened out of deregulation is letting the cancer grow.
Can I just...
John, go ahead, John.
Add there, because I'm sure Steve and I will agree on this one. There's no such thing as equilibrium.
Yay! 1 point of agreement. Yes.
There you go. So we'll stop there. There is no such thing as equilibrium in economics. It's just an educational way of trying to start an understanding.
But you talk about a natural rate of unemployment, John. That's an equilibrium concept.
No, it
natural
isn't.
Rate. Okay.
No, it isn't. It's what it says is the rate you have got is a rate that it's not natural of nature or anything. It says the rate you've got is the one you cannot manipulate away by manipulating demand. You've got to change something on the supply side of the economy to change that. But let me finish what I was saying, because it is important when you're trying to teach people things to start with a model and say, look, let's get a lot of the background out the way. Let's assume this, this, and this. And let's say, if we start with this, where do we go? Where do we go? Where do we go? And you come to a situation where you say, well, we've then moved from a non-equilibrium situation into an equilibrium. That's not reality. Reality is often just chasing equilibrium. For example, if you're a firm producing lots of things and you can't sell them, you need to move towards a situation where you can sell them. So what do? You lower your price, or you increase your marketing, or you try and change something in the marketplace. There are lots and lots of things that mean we tend towards equilibrium situations, but we never achieve equilibrium. And the important thing is for undergraduates and anyone trying to understand the subject, if you start with a simple model and then you get them to understand that simple model, then you build the behavioral stuff on top of that and the complex systems on top of that. So start simple, become complex. If you throw people straight in at complex, they just get lost and confused. So education and equilibrium go together. Equilibrium is not reality. It's just a way of getting people on the first rung of trying to understand a very complex world.
And it's the wrong rung. It's the wrong rung. Okay.
So where would
The
you
system is
start?
inherently
Yeah, where would you
it's
start, Steve?
the wrong place to start. Building economics from the bottom up, the whole idea of supply and demand equilibrium, blah, blah, blah. It's the wrong foundation for economic modeling. And I'm building the exact opposite of saying we come from the top down. We get a cyclical system. The question then is not letting the cycles lead to breakdown. So I said there's the neoclassical foundations is that they're neat, they're plausible, and they're wrong. And unfortunately, that's what gets taught to students at university. And that's why we get this delusional profession called economics, which I think is actually going to end up destroying capitalism, John, and possibly in our lifetimes.
So the important point thing is, do my undergraduates understand economics better than your undergraduates, Steve? You start from the top and go down. Do they find it easy to do that, or is it easy?
Yes, because I've given them the tools to do it, which is what Minsky is about, which you won't take a look at. So yeah, it does work quite well. Thank you very much.
I'm a great fan of your Minsky model. I have no problems with that. My problem is with the assumptions upon which you have built that model. Your mathematics it's like modern monetary theory. It's great. I agree with all the digits. Where they're going, it's what accountants would do if they were creating a modern monetary theory. But it's based upon the wrong assumptions, because what you've done is built upon the mistakes of Keynesian economists. You haven't gone out of that and gone, right, let's look at these assumptions first. And I can give you things in your model, and I'm sure if you put them into your model, you get the right answer. But because you've got modern monetary theory in there directing your attention, you get the wrong answer. It's like,
all I've got is accounting. All I've got is accounting. Assets minus liabilities equals equity. That's that's the foundation. You want to criticize that? Let's talk quantum mechanics as well.
Yeah, that's right.
It's
your accounting. And accountants are very precise about what they do. And one of the simple things they do, moving digits around, is they cannot distinguish, and modern monetary theory cannot distinguish between recycling old money and creating new money. And that's very important when it comes to what causes inflation and what doesn't.
Well, those are so many shots fired there. I don't even know what to say. I think
John is spot on that there is a difference between buying shares in an initial public offering of a firm or buying existing shares that somebody is dumping for whatever reason. Absolutely true. I think we can model that sort of behavior, have different accounts in our modeling software. So I don't think there's any barrier to including that sort of variables and concepts in our models. Let's do that, because I think John makes a very good point, and let's see the dynamic implications.
John, I've got a question here for you. If the traditional, models that you describe were, so well formed in their foundation, explain why they failed in predicting 2008, whereas Steve's model really from top to bottom demonstrated what that dynamic was. Explain to me why the DSGE models and the LMIS models, whatever you want to give the acronym, what failed with them?
Yeah. I'm not supporting those things. I mean, I worked a long time ago with a thesis on the input-output matrix, creating another column and another row to break up nations into regions. So you could have regional parts to this matrix. We then go to the dynamic stochastic equilibrium model. Again, a wrong model because it's a model based upon wrong assumptions. And speaking to people who actually develop the model and talking to them, and they go, it's lovely, this model. It's really a smashing model, beautiful model, but it gets everything wrong. It gets everything wrong because it's based upon the wrong assumptions. And that's the area which is, we've got to get that right. And I, as an economist, and Steve, we both want to debunk economics. And the area that we really want to debunk is what's happening in macroeconomics. We just want to debunk it in different ways. And
actually, I want to debunk micro too, John. I did one little point. Remember, you said a tweet at one stage saying, I think you and I'd agree on the micro, but differ on the macro. And fundamentally, I think the micro is nonsense in neoclassical economic theory. And that's where a lot of the problems come from.
My apologies, Steve. We want to debunk both macro and micro in different ways. But do you not see my point about education, that it's worthwhile in certain cases starting with a simple model and then criticize?
Look, I start with two definitions or three definitions.
Yeah.
The employment rate, the wages share of GDP, and the private debt ratio. And I can turn that into a model in about 5 to 10 minutes, which gives me Minsky's financial instability hypothesis.
Which is all macroeconomic.
Yeah, of course. Forget micro is upside down. Question: what shape does the marginal cost curve have?
Well, it has. If the average cost curve is a U shape, the marginal cost curve falls more quickly and cuts the average cost curve at the lowest point and then rises more quickly.
So that's the real world.
No, it illustrates for one firm, if you take fixed costs at 0 or fixed costs at 100 or fixed costs at 1,000, which are the same, then as you expand your firm, your unit or your average cost of production will fall. So it's quite reasonable to assume that a firm expanding will have a falling average cost curve. And then at some point, this economies of scale, we like to call it, the average cost curve will start to rise. The marginal cost will cut through that at the lowest point. And the good thing about building a model like that is that you can say to undergraduates, at what point do I profit maximize? And they'll all go, oh, it must be the lowest point on the average cost curve. And you go, no, it's not there. And they go, oh, well, it must be where the average and the average cost curve and the average revenue curve cut, because that's the highest output. And you go, no, it's not there. It's where marginal cost cuts marginal revenue. And you can explain that to them and they go, oh, yeah, got that. Now, no firm goes out there saying, we're going to find the point at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost because we can profit maximize. We are describing. What they do almost intuitively, because
so that's an accurate description of an individual firm, rising marginal cost.
No, but it's the accurate description of a model which you could develop from an understanding of the difference between fixed costs and variable costs as you expand output. You will produce that U shape in some firms, and in those firms, the marginal cost curve is derivative of the average cost curve, so it must look as I described.
Like so this, for example. Can I do a screen share here?
Yeah.
Possible?
Yeah, sure. Put it up.
Okay.
Steve wants to share his screen desperately today.
He does, doesn't he? Yes.
Yes, I know. Okay. So that's what the neoclassical theory teaches. Is that what you pretty much teach, what I'm showing there?
I haven't got it yet.
Hold on there a second, Steve.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks as though it came out of my book, that one.
Well, it's actually not your book. That's actually Samuelson and Nordhaus.
I know,
but nonetheless, that's what's in your book. That's in your book.
The model below I use a lot.
Now, what about this? What about this one? Hang on a second. Let's get down to it now. Let's see. Okay. Pardon me going. What about that one? Is that right or wrong?
I can't read those. Average total costs falling, average overhead costs. I can't read them all, Steve, to work it out.
Okay, that's got constant marginal cost and falling average cost.
So is
that realistic or unrealistic?
If it's got fixed costs involved, yes, that's realistic. If it's got fixed costs, because fixed costs,
but it's got constant or falling marginal costs, not rising.
Yeah, it's quite possible for average costs and marginal costs to continue falling over the whole range at which the market demands this product. If you carried on past that, it would start to go up, but you never get that far. And that's where you create a situation that produces a natural monopoly, because there's only going to have.
In fact, that is characteristic of 95% of firms, whereas this is characteristic of the best figure ever found is 1% of firms will report that sort of cost structure. So the model we have in microeconomics is factually wrong. And that's why I say you're starting from the wrong. That is a false model, but that's what we teach students.
Yeah, no,
that's why it's so bad.
you won't get natural monopolies in all these situations. But the important thing is, if you do get a natural monopoly, that's why you want government regulations to stop that happening and to promote competition, because you don't want the natural monopoly to be there, because the natural monopoly does produce a power and means that the consumer is not getting the best use of resources and the best option of products to consume. So I'm all against monopolies and natural monopolies.
Can I propose something? What about this one? Just for giggles. John has suggested that modern monetary theory, the accountancy stuff is probably okay, but there's some fundamentally wrong assumptions. He's skeptical about macro modeling, and yet he described a macroeconomic system to us over the last couple hours. Steve has said he'd love John to use Minsky. Why doesn't John work with, whether it's Steve or Ty or somebody who's familiar with Minsky, and map out John's mental model, his vision of the economy, including all the assumptions that he is comfortable with, and let's take a look at it and let's compare it to a Steve model. There might be a lot of agreement and only a few areas where there's disagreement, and either that's a research area or you can run the model two different ways. Every time there's a let's test something, increasing taxes, whatever, let's run it Steve's way and John's way, and let's see if it matters. Often with all these feedback loops, it don't matter.
Yeah, I like that's a great idea, Mike.
Well, I can provide the information to Steve, and he can run it through and see if it works on his system. I mean, the problem that Steve and I have is when we get together, we end up just drinking and taking selfies of each other.
Which is much better fun, because Mike, you're a good bloke, okay? And that's why you let me say some of my best friends are neoclassical.
Might be a project for a master's student to work with John, something like that, and just map out what his ideas are, his thoughts, his assumptions. And when he's satisfied, when you press the go button, what happens, right?
Yeah, I mean,
I'd like to see that.
I would love to see a model that really works. And I have great faith in Steve's model. The model's fine. And the model, I'm sure, would work if we just change some of the assumptions in it. For example, let's go with a model that doesn't create money when governments spend and destroy money when governments tax. Let's go with a model that you can't manipulate demand to create an increase in output, but you could change supply conditions to get an increase in output. We have fundamental differences about the assumptions, and I think Steve and I have got to agree on our assumptions. Are these assumptions right or wrong? And if we have agreement on our assumptions, then you can start putting things into that model, and let's see what the outcomes are from doing that. I'd love to be able to tell governments that they've got to do this in order to get a good, positive outcome. And the problem that I've had over all these years is that the things I say are not what government wants to hear. I often say to my undergraduates, if I stand here and say, look, I really cannot do this, I cannot improve on that, and I can't do that, and someone else stands next to me and said, no, I can increase education spending, I can do this, I can do that, I can do this. You go, well, who do you vote for? And of course, no one would vote for me because I said I can't do anything. And that other person said they'll do everything. You vote for them. So they want models that say these are all the things that we can do. And even if they fail, as they will, because they can't do these things, people will look at me and say, well, look, at least they tried, you didn't.
John, what you mentioned something there that was quite interesting to me. Taxes. When taxes are paid, what happens to deposit accounts, private deposit accounts in the commercial banking sector?
If you pay your tax out of your current account at your bank, then they go down. All that does is recycle money. So it's taking money, one digit from one account and putting that digit into another account. That's a recycling situation. And new money creation comes through monetary policy. And the best way to see that is to look at the budget deficit. If this budget deficit is financed by selling the debt to you four people there, you buy the lot. That's all recycling. There's no new money, no old money. If, however, I can't sell it all to you and some is left unsold at the central bank, then money gets printed to that value. Or if indeed I use a sort of cheating system, I go, well, I'm going to quantitatively ease the amount of the debt that I can't sell. that creates new money. So there are important things that Steve and I should really work on is the difference between recycled old money and new money. Warren Mosley and I had a massive long argument about trying to get him to understand the difference between recycled money and the creation of new money.
Okay, but commercial deposit money isn't in the central bank
No.
balance sheet.
Correct. And that's where the two important things are, that the basis of the monetary system is on the Bank of England money, if you like, cash. And the Bank of England controls, or used to control more precisely, the amount of lending that banks can do, and therefore the money creation that banks can do. They didn't make a very good job of it recently, and you'll need to use this for one of your talks in the future. The real problem going forward is what's called a central bank digital currency. And it's a real problem because you can put the word P in front of it, which is programmable. And if you can start removing cash from the system and program a central bank digital currency, then you can give people restrictions in as much as you can say, well, with your income, you can only buy these things. You've got to buy environmentally friendly things. You can't put any petrol in your car. You've got to go and buy, you can't gamble with this money. You can't buy too many sweets with it. And in fact, we want you to spend all that money because if you don't, we're going to take it away at the end of the month. With programmable digital currencies, you can do that. That's a big worry going forward and a good area for a chat in the future.
So I guess we're at the top of the hour, 2 hours here. I want to ask you one question. I kind of avoided it because I don't know if it's your wheelhouse, but I want your opinion on climate change. Is it something we should be concerned about? Is it actually happening in your opinion? Is it happening but not a serious problem? Is it happening and it is a serious problem? What are your thoughts?
I'll give you the economist's answer. I don't know how serious the problem is, but I do know that you have got to cost benefit everything that you say. It's no good saying, oh, the world's going to collapse, so costs don't matter. Because there are lots of things out there that you can do to improve the environment and to reduce carbon emissions that are fairly cheap and have big benefits. There are also a lot of things out there that are very expensive to do and will impinge again upon the poorest group of people most, very expensive things to do, and will have very minimal effects. And that's where we've got to work hard, because if you take electric cars at the moment, I suspect we're getting to a sort of crossover point now where it's going to be more beneficial for the environment to have petrol cars than it is to have electric cars. But we don't think about that because electric is the way to go. Tata are being given lots of money by the UK government at the moment to produce electric arc furnaces to make steel because that's greener. No one's costed whether or not it would be better to continue with coal-fired on steel, because that's something that the costs aren't there. If we talk about climate change, then anything that will be beneficial, no costs don't matter, and I think they do matter, and we've got to look very carefully at that, because with climate change, one is it happening? Why is it happening? Can we do anything about it? What's the cost of doing things about it, and what are the benefits of doing things about it? Because the last thing you want is to create an impoverished world because you tried to deal with a problem that you couldn't deal with in the first place, or that you couldn't deal with efficiently in the first place. And what I would like, and if it goes out to any media outlets, I'd like you to get rid of the Trusted News Initiative, and I would like you to start debating and discussing these issues. Things aren't settled science. The pandemic was never settled science. Climate change was never settled science. We should have people, as Steve and I are arguing now, we should have people arguing about these things, not just accepting one group of experts who are pushing out any thoughts from other groups of experts. Take a vote. Should people now listen to Steve, or should people listen to me? And if they say people should listen to Steve, should I then be cancelled and muted and not able to contradict? Well, Steve says yes, but we know why.
Okay, and I'm not gonna let Steve. No, Steve, I'm not, because everybody already knows.
But I want to
Um,
send John a copy of my report, okay, John, because you think cost benefit hasn't been done. It has, but it's been done so badly that I think even you would think this is shit. If you don't think it's shit, I'm sorry, but you really shouldn't be involved in the debate over climate science. So I'll send you a copy of the report. I'd like to get your reaction. So far, every neoclassical economist I've shown it to has said there's nothing wrong. What's the problem? And I think that shows how badly neoclassical thinking infects people's reasoning capabilities.
Thank you, Steve.
So we'll get everybody to kind of stay after the final credits. John, stick around. We'll just have a little personal conversation afterwards. Everybody in the chat, thank you. It was very, very lively. Lots of opinions were put out there, but we appreciate you. We appreciate John. Spent 2 hours fighting through internet connections.
Trying to plug it.
He joined what you could say is a hostile room. And he was quite eloquent. And it was a great honor to have you on, John. We're going to do this again for sure. Until next week, bye-bye. In the face of the daunting challenge that is climate change, it is important to remember that we possess the power to create a better future. While the impacts of climate change are undeniable and at times overwhelming, there are countless reasons to remain hopeful. First and foremost, we are witnessing an unprecedented global awakening to the urgent need for climate action. Communities, governments, and businesses around the world are coming together like never before to address this crisis. The voices of young activists, scientists, and concerned citizens are resonating louder than ever, pushing the change at every level of society. Innovation is another great source of optimism. Every day, new breakthroughs in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and eco-friendly technologies are emerging. We are on the brink of a transformative advancement that will enable us to reduce our carbon footprint and transition towards a more sustainable, resilient world. The power of collective action cannot be underestimated. We've seen nations commit to ambitious climate goals, and grassroots movements making an impact on local levels. The Paris Agreement and other international agreements demonstrate a shared commitment to a greener future. Nature itself is a remarkable ally to our fight against climate change. Ecosystem restoration, reforestation, and sustainable land management can help us absorb carbon emissions and protect biodiversity. By working with nature rather than against it, we can mitigate the worst effects of climate change. Each and every one of us has a role to play, from reducing our personal carbon footprint to supporting policies and initiatives that promote sustainability. We can contribute to a positive change. Our voices matter, our choices matter, and they can inspire others to take action as well. Remember, hope is a powerful force. It's a belief that we can overcome even the most significant challenges. Together with determination and a shared vision, we can create a world where future generations can thrive, surrounded by clean air, abundant resources, and a stable climate. Let's embrace this challenge as an opportunity to build a brighter, more sustainable future for all. The path may be difficult, but the destination is worth every effort.